Hello and welcome to India's World. Today we are going to discuss the sanctions against Russia imposed by the US and the European Union in the wake of its intervention in Ukraine. The first set of sanctions against Russia were announced by the US a day after the Crimean parliament voted to separate from Ukraine. It targeted a list of Russian officials considered to be important in handling the Crimean situation. The European Union followed with its own sanctions but targeting less important officials. A second set of sanctions was imposed on April 28th as the US claimed that Russia was continuing its aggression in eastern Ukraine. The new round of US sanctions slapped visa bans and asset freezes on some more Russian officials. The European Union has also come up with additional sanctions. The questions we are asking today are, why have attempts to de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine failed? Will the sanctions against Russia affect its policy towards Ukraine? And how is the Ukrainian crisis likely to unfold in the coming days and weeks? To discuss these questions and these issues, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary of India, a formidable diplomat, and also a one-time ambassador to Russia. We have Ambassador Sudhir Devare. He was first Indian ambassador to Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia. He was also the chairman earlier of Indian Council for World Affairs. And we have with us Ambassador Prabhat Shukla. He was India's ambassador to Russia and is currently the joint director of a think tank, Vivekananda International Foundation, and was the first to set up the Indian diplomatic mission in Ukraine. So I welcome all of you to this discussion. Ambassador Sibal, let's begin by setting the context for the latest round of sanctions. After the annexation of Crimea, the Geneva Agreement tried to de-escalate the tension, called on all sides to refrain from violence, provocation, extremism. Armed groups were to lay down their arms. Buildings that were occupied were to be handed over to the interim government. That hasn't happened. 15 cities are still occupied. It also said that the OSCE, or Organization for Security, Cooperation and Cooperation in Europe, was to monitor the agreed de-escalation. In fact, the OSCE monitors have been abducted and kidnapped and are still in captivity. Constitutional process was to begin to decentralize the governance of Ukraine. None of that has happened. So has the Geneva Agreement failed, and why has it failed?
Well, the Russians are saying, the Russian Foreign Minister just said today or yesterday that the Geneva Agreement has failed. Following what happened in Odessa and Slavyansk, where the radicals from Western Ukraine and the Ukrainian government, interim government, have launched operations against the Russian-speaking population of eastern Ukraine. But I think the Geneva Agreement was a last-ditch effort to find some kind of common diplomatic ground to de-escalate the crisis, something which I think Russia would want, genuinely want, and to my mind the West does not genuinely want. The West is, right from the start, to my mind, is primarily responsible for the escalation of this crisis because they have simply been unwilling to take into account Russia's sensitivities and interests and the neocons in United States, which now span both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and some of their geostrategists are hell-bent on destabilizing Russia's interests in the Ukraine. The basic point is, to my mind, the Russian proposal and all the elements that you have mentioned in it is the sensible way to approach the whole issue. Okay. But the United States is so much committed to the interim government, having invited Yatsenyuk immediately after the takeover through the mob rule to Washington, etc., etc., that any stepping backwards and meeting Russians' demands would seem now to be an additional diplomatic and political defeat for the Americans after the Russians annexed Crimea. So I would say that the bad faith almost entirely lies on the Western side.
Well, Ambassador Devare, I mean, that's an assertion, but we'll discuss it further. There's a difference between the West and Russia over the degree of decentralization that would bring peace in Ukraine. The emphasis of the West is merely decentralization, while the Russians want a federation in Ukraine with the federating regions and constituencies having power to make foreign policy and economic policy. Now, why do the Russians want that? How does it benefit them?
Well, clearly, they would like to see that Russian-speaking areas, particularly in the east and southeast Ukraine, get greater autonomy, greater freedom. There will be less control from Kiev on these areas. Since its independence in 92, Ukraine has followed a very unitary kind of constitution, and the Russians would like to see it is more pluralistic and more decentralized. The West would like to see that Russian interference or control over these areas in the East also gets reduced. But talking about the Geneva process, it seems that there were apparently not adequate compulsions on both sides to really bring the two sides, West and EU on one side and Ukraine and Russia on the other, to the table, because no sooner than the meeting was over that the troubles again continued. And so far there has not been really any reduction in that. So I think we'll have to see how clearly I think it's a larger geopolitical game that is being played out. And as Kanwal just now said, the neocons in the US, the strategists in the US are really following a certain agenda on that. On the other hand, Russians also, after annexation or getting Crimea now into Russia, are seeing that they can really exercise greater control on the eastern. Though they say that they are not going to invade or occupy.
So you're saying bad faith is on both sides?
I think it's on both sides.
Let me take the bad faith question to Ambassador Shukla. Do you think IMF has also acted in bad faith, giving a 17 billion financial package to Ukraine? Should they have waited or linked it with de-escalation? Should they have waited till the presidential election of May 25th, when a new government, a legitimate government with a popular mandate is in power?
Okay, I think we're going to need to tie in a couple of strands. Actually, the IMF's role, since you asked, we'll begin with that. The IMF's role in catalyzing this particular round of difficulties, that is to say from November, December 2013, has been not adequately reflected upon. The real reason that Yanukovych actually gave up the Eastern Partnership Agreement was the demand by the IMF. They were at that stage advancing, I think, a similar amount, $17, $18 billion. They had two requirements, as the IMF usually does. The first was that the subventions, the subsidies would be reduced. And the second was that particularly energy prices would be freed up. And Yanukovych looked at that and blanched. You know, the fact is that Ukraine is still not a viable economic or political entity 20 years after independence. This is the crux of the problem. And I think the West has been aggravating it by, you know, we talked about the Geneva Agreement. I would throw into the argument also the February 21 agreement. In both cases, there was a deal to come to a sort of compromise situation, but as we know, it was Western inspired elements that torpedoed both the agreements. And today, I think the fundamental problem is that the Americans are not recognizing that the current government in Kiev is an illegitimate one. And therefore, when you say, you know, everyone should disarm and everyone should stop using force, in the East, the first thing they said is, well, let them also clear out from the official buildings. They won't do that. And until you have clarity on these basics, you're not going to get any forward movement. And therefore, I would say, what we now need to look at is the presidential election, which is not far away, 3 weeks away. Somehow, not much seems to be moving on that.
We'll discuss that in a minute.
We'll discuss
that in a minute, but we need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the US sanctions and EU sanctions against Russia. Ambassador Sibal, a quick answer to this. Do you think that the interim government in Kiev has taken military action in eastern Ukraine because they want to influence or prevent the referendum which is scheduled for May 11th on independence?
Well, you know, again, I see clearly an American hand behind this, because the CIA director went there a short while ago, and Vice President Biden went there, and they have given full encouragement to the Ukrainian government to take armed action against the people protesting in eastern Ukraine. Yes, on the one hand, it is clear that the government at the center in Kiev has to show that it's in control. And if there is some sort of rebellion in any part of the country, they have to use the armed force to try and quell it. But then if the legitimacy of the government itself is being questioned, you're not going to have a solution by using armed force. And Russia has clearly warned, Putin has warned more than once that at some point he would be forced to intervene if this carried on. So I think the Kiev government has been very foolish, and its Western backers are being reckless in trying to provoke a genuine conflict, military conflict on the ground in the Ukraine.
Yeah. Let me take this to Ambassador Shukla. Who is the victim here? I mean, listening to this discussion, it seems that the Russians are the victims, but it's Ukraine which has lost territory.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of approaching the question. The Russians are the victims in the sense, if you put it in its larger geopolitical context, which is that they have been under pressure, under relentless pressures, even after 1992. But in the smaller picture, you're quite right. I think both of them are actually victims, and surely the Ukrainians have suffered rather more. One thing is very clear: the eastern populations east of the river Dnieper want a federation, and they will not settle for less.
Okay, Ambassador Devare, what is the purpose of these sanctions against Russia? Can they undo anything, or do they merely show the displeasure of the US, European Union, Switzerland and Japan?
I think the West knows that sanctions are not really going to have such a compelling effect on Russia. But this is one way of showing their displeasure. Perhaps to some extent over a long period, sanctions may have also effect, because the sanctions now relate to supplies of high technology, space related equipment, a lot of dual purpose technology, and given Russia's dependence on military exports, oil technology, these could have. Also, they are targeting certain key individuals who have large assets.
But is that because they don't want to target the larger Russian population?
They are not targeting actually business, direct business leaders also, and population as well, because Russia, they would like to continue to do business. I think the real beneficiary geopolitically in this whole episode is going to be China. And I really wonder why the Americans are not really giving enough thought to this, because Russia has already in a way been overtaken by China as a major peer power.
I don't want to go in there just now. I'd like to stick to the sanctions. Ambassador Sibal, there were indications earlier that the sanctions could be much more severe. That the Americans would target Gazprom Bank, they would target the Russian Development Bank, which is the main investment arm for Central Asia. And the Gazprom Bank, in fact, moved its assets of about 6.9 billion in foreign currency from back to the central bank. They reportedly closed 80% of their foreign deposits, expecting these sanctions. Now, why didn't the US take these sanctions? Why didn't it impose these sanctions? Because they would really hurt.
You know, I have a very fundamental, how should I say, objection to this whole business of sanctions, and I would wish that a situation arises at some point in time that the West has a taste of its own medicines and the rest of the international community can impose these kind of sanctions on the United States and Europe, because they have a free hand, because they control the international financial system.
But within the logic of sanctions?
No, it is a very objectionable way of dealing with any country, and especially a country like Russia.
It's better than war, short of war.
No, but this is the precursor to steps that can lead to a more serious conflict. And there is absolutely no reason why they should sanction high-level policy makers in Russia who are looking after national interests and are taking decisions on the basis of what they see is the reality on the ground. And you are treating them as rogues and semi-rogues. I mean, you could even, you can even impose sanctions directly on Putin. Why not do that? Why only his senior people around his entourage?
Because of calibration.
No, because they are saying quite clearly that they are targeting Putin and in a circle in order to divide Putin from his inner circle hurt the business interests of people around. This is lawlessness at the international level. This is not sanctioned by the international community or the United Nations or any of the multilateral organizations which should actually have a role in the conduct of international relations.
I think you've made the point. You've made the point. But let me take a slightly different question to you, Ambassador Shukla. See, the objective of sanctions, within the logic of sanctions, not outside as Ambassador Sibal is pointing out.
Sure.
Within the logic of sanctions, the objective is to induce behavioral change.
Yes.
Now, to be effective, therefore, sanctions have to hurt.
Yes.
But if they hurt too much, you may go to war, because you may say that it's well worth going to war. So, in this case, will these sanctions, as they stand today, by EU, US, Japan and Switzerland, achieve the behavioral change that they want? Will it affect the foreign policy of Russia towards Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. And the Russians have made that very clear. Look, it's like this. The Russian economy, let's begin at the beginning. The Russian economy is very vulnerable. And I think in all these discussions that we have, right or wrong, this must be factored in. And we've seen in the first 5 months of this year, the capital outflows from Russia have been a little over $50 billion, more than twice the amount in the same period last year. So they are hemorrhaging, the ruble is falling, the stock markets are falling, and the greatest Russian vulnerability is its oil and gas exports. They earn something like 70% of their foreign exchange earnings through oil and gas exports, and about 80% of that comes from the EU. So when we say the EU is reliant on Russia, it's more true to say that Russia is reliant on the EU. Now, why aren't they going further? My answer is one word: Germany. It's quite clear. There was a Wall Street Journal article yesterday saying that companies like Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank, BASF are telling Merkel that they do not want any harsher sanctions against the Russians.
Okay.
I think that really is the critical point, and Germany is the pivotal country in the Western alliance from the Russian point of view.
All right. We need to take a break again at this point. We'll be back again with this interesting discussion in a bit. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the sanctions against Ukraine. Ambassador Devare, you are discussing whether sanctions need to be calibrated within the logic of sanctions. Do you think this is the reason why the United States is being careful not to do anything that might threaten the entire regime? Therefore, don't target financial institutions. There was also some talk of their actually banning all credit card transactions by Visa and MasterCard. And that's why the Russian Duma, 2 days before the sanctions, passed a law where these two companies had to deposit huge amounts of money equivalent to 2 days of transactions as a guarantee of their good behavior. So is America calibrating the sanctions carefully?
Well, they know very well. I think this whole concept of sanctions itself is in a way flawed because it has not been seen to be really working effectively. There have been so many past precedents. There are clearly vulnerabilities on both sides. The West needs Russia, Russia needs the West. And I think this war of words through sanctions, and now actually it's becoming physical war with helicopters being brought down and people getting killed in Ukraine. I think this will go on for a while, certainly till the elections in Ukraine. But at some stage, I think they will have to go back to Geneva process.
Yeah. Ambassador Sibal, how do you see President Putin's dilemma in the face of the sanctions? See, his popularity has soared ever since the sanctions were imposed. But if he doesn't retaliate, it might also dip, do you think?
Well, after the second round of sanctions, Putin has said that his government had prepared a list of retaliatory sanctions, but he held back his hand. I think wisely so, because they can continue to play this game, but this will ratchet up the confrontation more and more, which Russia also sees is not in his longer-term interest. His idea would be to divide Europe and United States. But the information I get is that despite all the valid points that have been made about the vulnerability of the Russian economy, I don't think they're going to blink because their geopolitical interests in Ukraine far outweigh any reasonable, logical geopolitical interests that the West has in Ukraine. Therefore, there's a mismatch there, and Russia will stand firm.
Okay. Ambassador Shukla, Russia has already annexed Crimea, and if you look at the text of the Geneva Agreement, it's almost as if the annexation never happened. It's not mentioned anywhere, suggesting that the West has reconciled to the annexation of Crimea, and the focus is that more of that should not happen. But what about eastern Ukraine? What might happen there? My question really is, does the US or the EU have the appetite to deal with the situation where Moscow is forced to react militarily in eastern Ukraine?
Yeah, look, this is the most important question that we are looking at in the short term. The Russians have announced very clearly that they do not aim to acquire, I'm not comfortable with the word annex, not in the context of the Crimea. Crimea is a really sui generis. But in the other places, I don't think that this is their objective. And they have very clearly stated that their objective is a federal Ukraine. You know, in the Soviet Union, there were 3 districts in Ukraine. Ukraine itself has created 9 after independence. So the logic of federalism is there in their own constitution. I would say the Russians don't want to occupy or acquire this part of Ukraine. If somehow they are forced into it, the consequences will be much harsher. I think even the Germans will have to go along with much harsher sanctions, and those sanctions can hurt. You know, one simple thing that the Americans can do, as they've done with Iran, is just put a block on dollar transactions. It will hurt the Russians very badly.
Ambassador Devare, do you agree with this analysis? Do you foresee some kind of military intervention in eastern Ukraine the way the situation is going out of control?
Well, I think instability in Ukraine and Eastern Europe doesn't help Russia either. And therefore, I think Russia could be content with what has happened vis-a-vis Crimea. It is now part of Russia.
Why didn't they want federalism when the Crimea issue was there? So you can't have federalism when it is convenient to you and not talk about federalism when it's convenient to annex a country or a region.
Well, federalism process will take time, and you know, Ukraine also has to accept the fact of plurality.
I was more on the Russian double standards on federalism.
Well, I think Crimea was a different case, and Crimea, they didn't expect the world will accept Crimean, takeover so soon. In fact, I think the whole Crimean business came to Russia in a sense, very unexpectedly, though they seem to have made all the preparations beforehand. But barring the kind of stage which was prepared by the West, Crimea was not an issue on the table.
Okay.
And
quickly, you wanted to say something, add something.
Just since your question is on Crimea, I think there is a difference, and that difference relates to the Black Sea. The Black Sea is a critical Russian interest, and the danger in the Crimea, and you notice after the reunification, they have made Sevastopol, which is the home of the Black Sea Fleet, what we would call a union territory. It is administered now directly from Moscow.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. But my question to you, Ambassador Sibal, is slightly different, taking off from what you were saying earlier. You suggested that the US hand diplomatically is pretty weak in Ukraine, largely because there aren't sort of major US interests there, not in the same degree as, say, the Russian strategic interests. So what else makes the diplomatic hand of the US weak in the region?
No. One is a defensive interest, one is an offensive interest. Russia's defensive interests in Ukraine are far more powerful than America's offensive interests. Because America wants to destabilize ultimately the Russia itself and change the regime in Russia and extend the NATO as far deep into traditional Russian territories, with Georgia and Ukraine being the target countries. And they think the spillover effect of that would be the change of regime in Russia, which with Putin ousted and the way he has managed Putin Russia politically and economically, that model should be exposed as unworkable, etc., etc. So that's their game, but that's an offensive interest. So I meant it in that context.
Okay, all right. But let me just quickly ask you one question. Why should Ukraine be allowed to choose its allies? If it wants to go with Europe, let it go to Europe. After all, in 2004, they won the Eurovision Song Contest. Subsequently, twice they've come second in the Eurovision Song. Not that Eurovision Song Contest is something very big, but I'm saying the aspiration is towards Europe. Why should anybody deny that aspiration? Okay, all of you.
Well, firstly, very simply and very shortly, the Western Ukrainians want that, the Eastern Ukrainians don't.
Okay.
So then who decides? Which is why I think the best solution, as somebody is suggesting, is like in the case of Czechoslovakia, you just divide Ukraine. Let Eastern Ukraine go towards the European Union. Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukrainian has special ties with Russia.
Okay.
The way the EU-Ukraine agreement was being negotiated, I think created enough worries to Russia. That should have been handled a little better because, if they wanted to sign that agreement, fair enough. It was up to Ukraine to sign it. And if so many countries in Eastern Europe have that agreement now with the European Union, it was not even accession to European Union, but only an economic agreement. But I think that gave enough room for Russia to feel apprehensive.
Right.
Well, I'm glad you've asked this question. Actually, it's a very legitimate question. The answer is this. In his speech at the Duma, Putin said that one thing we are not going to accept is NATO forces directly on our borders. And that, unfortunately, is what Ukraine seems to want. And here
Ukraine wasn't joining NATO.
That is part of their long-term plan.
Okay.
First step was the Eastern Partnership, then EU membership, then NATO. They're open about it. Okay. And the problem is that A, Russia doesn't want it, B, a segment, something like 30% of the population, is equally rooted in its opposition to the same idea. There is one other angle, that was the economic engagement with Europe. And there, what the Russians said was, make your choice. If you want an Eastern Partnership with a free trade agreement with Europe, do so, but then the benefits you are getting from us by way of a special economic relationship will lapse.
Okay.
And that was the crux where the Ukrainians wanted, especially Yanukovych wanted both things, and the Russians stumped up the money that he needed desperately.
All right. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for taking time out and discussing the situation for our viewers. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week with another interesting issue. Till then, goodbye and thanks for watching.